What does it cost to bury a queen? Does a pound of gold in a coffin make grief feel lighter? How long must a kingdom mourn to prove its love? And what happens when a funeral is not about sadness, but about showing the world you are still in charge? The end of a queen's life is rarely a quiet affair. It becomes a stage for power, wealth, and sometimes desperation. A queen's final journey is often the most extravagant one she ever takes. Number 15, did a pharaoh queen plan her own disappearance? Hatshepsut's body was not found in her magnificent tomb. For centuries, it was believed her successor tried to erase her from history, chiseling her name from monuments. The search for her mummy became one of modern Egyptology's greatest detective stories. When it was finally identified in 2007, it was found in a minor tomb, belonging to her wet nurse. She was a pharaoh who ruled as a king, often depicted with a male body and a false beard. Her death and burial are shrouded in a mystery. She may have orchestrated herself. Her Hatshepsut was not born to be the supreme ruler of Egypt. She was the daughter of a pharaoh, Thutmose I, and the wife of her half-brother, Thutmose II. When her husband died, the throne passed to his infant son, Thutmose III, born to a lesser wife. Hatshepsut was meant to be the regent, the power behind the throne until the boy came of age. But Hatshepsut had other plans. She was ambitious and understood the levers of power. Within a few years, she did something unprecedented. She declared herself pharaoh. To legitimize this move, she claimed the god Amun-Ra had appeared to her mother in the form of the pharaoh and declared that Hatshepsut was his divine daughter, destined to rule. This was a brilliant piece of political theater. She couldn't change her gender, but she could change the narrative. She began to adopt the full titles and imagery of a king. In statues and reliefs, she was shown with the traditional kilt, crown, and false beard of a pharaoh. It was a bold statement. She was not a queen holding a place for a man. She was the king. Her reign, lasting over 2 decades in the 15th century BC, was one of peace and immense prosperity. Instead of waging costly wars, she focused on trade and construction. She sent a famous expedition to the land of Punt, a mysterious kingdom likely on the coast of modern-day Eritrea or Somalia. The ships returned laden with gold, ivory, incense, and live myrrh trees, which she had planted at her temple. It was a stunning success that brought exotic wealth and prestige to Egypt. Her greatest legacy, however, was her building program. She commissioned hundreds of construction projects throughout Upper and Lower Egypt. The centerpiece was her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. It remains one of the most beautiful and impressive structures of ancient Egypt. Carved into a cliff face, it is a series of terraced colonnades rising towards a sanctuary. The walls are covered in detailed reliefs telling the story of her divine birth and her expedition to Punt. This temple was not just a place for her worship after death, it was a permanent monument to the legitimacy and glory of her reign. She built it to ensure she would never be forgotten, and that brings us to her death and burial. The preparations for a pharaoh's funeral were a lifelong affair. Hatshepsut commanded the construction of a tomb for herself in the Valley of the Kings, the traditional burial place for pharaohs. Her tomb, now known as KV-20, was unique. It was one of the earliest tombs in the valley, and was extended to accommodate not just her, but also her father, Thutmose I. She had his sarcophagus moved to lie beside hers, a move designed to further link her reign to his respected one. Her mortuary temple, Djeser Djeseru, or Holiest of Holies, was where the public rituals celebrating her life would take place for eternity. Priests were endowed with land and goods to ensure her cult would continue, making daily offerings to sustain her spirit in the afterlife. The scale was immense. The temple was connected to the Nile by a grand causeway lined with sphinxes. It was designed to overwhelm any visitor and leave no doubt about the power of the pharaoh buried within. When she died around 1458 BC, the full funerary rites of a pharaoh would have been performed. Her body would have been taken to a special workshop for the mummification process, which lasted 70 days. The internal organs, except for the heart, were removed and placed in canopic jars. The body was then dried out using natron, a type of salt, before being carefully wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen bandages. Amulets and jewels were placed between the layers of wrappings to protect her on her journey to the afterlife. Her mummified body, adorned with a golden mask, would then be placed in a series of nested coffins and finally into a stone sarcophagus. The funeral procession from the mummification temple to the Valley of the Kings would have been a massive public event. The priests would have chanted spells from the Book of the Dead. Professional mourners, women hired to wail and tear their clothes, would have demonstrated the grief of the nation. The coffin would have been ferried across the Nile to the West Bank, the land of the dead, and then dragged on a sledge to her tomb. The tomb itself was filled with everything she would need in the next life: furniture, food, wine, clothing, jewelry, and statues of servants to wait on her. But here is where the story takes a sharp turn. After her death, her stepson, Thutmose III, finally became the sole ruler. For the first 20 years of his reign, he seemed to respect her memory. But then, something changed. A campaign began to systematically erase Hatshepsut from the historical record. Her statues were smashed, her name and image were chiseled off temple walls, and her obelisks were walled up. Her name was omitted from official lists of kings. It was an attempt to pretend she had never ruled. For centuries, this was seen as an act of pure vengeance by a stepson who had waited in the wings for too long. But modern historians have a more nuanced view. The erasure was not immediate and it was not total. It may have been a political calculation by Thutmose III to ensure a smooth succession for his own son. A female pharaoh was a break with tradition, a disruption to the concept of cosmic order, or Ma'at. By removing her, he may have been restoring that order, ensuring no future woman would attempt to take the throne. The fate of her body remained a mystery. Her grand tomb in the Valley of the Kings was found to be empty of her remains. For a long time, it was assumed her mummy had been destroyed, but the truth was more complicated. In 1903, the archaeologist Howard Carter discovered another tomb, KV60. It was a small, undecorated tomb, clearly not for a pharaoh. Inside were two female mummies. One was identified as Hatshepsut's wet nurse. The other lay on the floor, anonymous and ignored. Decades passed. In 2007, a team of Egyptologists led by Zahi Hawass decided to re-examine the anonymous mummy from KV60. They had a clue: a wooden box inscribed with Hatshepsut's name, found in another cache, contained a mummified liver and a single tooth. Using CT scans, they were able to match the tooth perfectly to a missing socket in the jaw of the unidentified mummy. It was her. The great Pharaoh Hatshepsut had been found not in her glorious tomb, but in the humble tomb of her servant. Why? The reason is still debated. Was she moved there by Thutmose III to hide her away? Or, in a more intriguing theory, was she moved by priests loyal to her memory during a later period when tomb robbing was rampant? They may have moved her to this insignificant tomb to protect her body from desecration, a final act of loyalty to the queen they had served. Her grand funeral plans, her magnificent temple, her secure tomb, all were designed for an eternity of glory. In the end, her eternal survival depended not on grandeur, but on obscurity. Her disappearance was her salvation. Number 14 was a queen buried with an entire army of paper. The funeral of Empress Dowager Cixi cost an estimated 1.2 million taels of silver. That is roughly equivalent to 44 tons of pure silver. It took over a year to transport her coffin from the Forbidden City to her tomb, a journey of about 80 miles. Her tomb was filled with so much treasure that it took 37 carts to carry just the inventory list. Among the items buried with her were mountains of paper replicas of palaces, servants, and soldiers, all to be burned so she could use them in the afterlife. And Empress Dowager Cixi was one of the most powerful women in Chinese history. For nearly half a century, from 1861 until her death in 1908, she was the de facto ruler of the Qing Dynasty. She began her life in the Forbidden City as a low-ranking concubine to the Xianfeng Emperor, but she was intelligent and ambitious. She gave birth to the emperor's only surviving son, which dramatically elevated her status. When the emperor died, her 5-year-old son became the Tongzi Emperor. Cixi, along with the emperor's principal wife Xian, became co-regents. She quickly outmaneuvered her political rivals and consolidated power. Even after her son came of age, she retained immense influence. When he died young without an heir, she installed her young nephew on the throne as the Guangxu emperor, allowing her to continue her regency. She was a master of court politics, playing factions against each other and using a network of loyal officials to maintain control. To her detractors, she was a cruel and corrupt despot whose conservatism held China back. To her supporters, she was a brilliant political strategist who held the crumbling Qing Dynasty together in a time of immense foreign pressure and internal rebellion. Whatever the judgment of history, one thing is certain: Cixi understood the importance of spectacle and power. This was never more apparent than in the preparations for her death and funeral. She began planning her tomb, the Eastern Qing tombs, in 1873. It was a lavish affair even by imperial standards. The halls were decorated with gold leaf, and the stone carvings of dragons and phoenixes were said to be the most beautiful of all the Qing tombs. Construction was completed, but Cixi was not satisfied. She later complained that the tomb was not grand enough. In 1895, she ordered it to be completely renovated and expanded, a project that took 13 years. The cost was astronomical. She used funds that had been earmarked for modernizing the Chinese Navy, a decision that would have disastrous consequences in the First Sino-Japanese War. But for Cixi, her eternal resting place was more important than a fleet of modern battleships. Her tomb was her final statement of power. She died on November 15th, 1908, just one day after the mysterious death of her nephew, the Guangxu emperor, whom she had held under house arrest for years. The timing was highly suspicious, and many believe she had him poisoned to prevent him from taking power and reversing her policies after her death. With her death, the meticulously planned funeral began. Her body was placed in a coffin made of Nanmu wood, a rare and precious material that was believed to preserve the body. The coffin was painted with 49 layers of lacquer and decorated with gold. According to palace records, the inside of her coffin was a treasure chest. It was lined with silk and pearls. Her body was dressed in ceremonial robes woven with gold thread and adorned with pearls. At her feet were placed lotus flowers made of jade. It is said she held a priceless jade cabbage in her hand. The coffin was filled with over 100 rare treasures, including pearls, rubies, sapphires, and diamonds. The estimated value of the coffin's contents alone was staggering. One pearl on her headdress was said to be the size of a robin's egg. The mourning period was long and complex. For a full year, her coffin remained in the Forbidden City, while auspicious dates were calculated for the burial. During this time, elaborate ceremonies were held daily. A vast array of funerary items were prepared. In Chinese tradition, it was believed that the deceased would need all the comforts of life in the afterlife. But instead of burying real objects and people, paper replicas known as joss paper or spirit money were created to be burned. The smoke would carry these items to the spirit world. For Cixi, this was done on an industrial scale. Artisans created life-size paper replicas of her favorite palaces, complete with courtyards and furniture. They built paper servants, eunuchs, and an entire paper army to protect her. There were paper horses, paper sedan chairs, and paper chests filled with paper money. The scale of this paper world was a direct reflection of her earthly power. On the day of the funeral, these massive paper constructions were burned in giant bonfires, a spectacle of consumption meant to equip her for eternity. Finally, in November 1909, a year after her death, the funeral procession began. It was one of the last great imperial spectacles of old China. The procession was led by a contingent of the modern army, but the heart of it was traditional. Hundreds of pallbearers, moving in shifts, carried the immensely heavy coffin. They were followed by officials, nobles, and Buddhist and Taoist priests chanting scriptures. The route was 80 miles long and took 5 days to traverse. The road was specially prepared, covered in yellow sand, the imperial color. Along the way, temporary pavilions were set up for the procession to rest. The sheer logistics were mind-boggling. An army of workers and servants moved with the procession, providing food and shelter. The sound of gongs, bells, and mournful music filled the air for the entire journey. When the procession finally reached the Eastern Qing tombs, a series of complex rituals were performed before the coffin was sealed inside the burial chamber. The grandeur of Cixi's funeral was meant to be a final, definitive statement of the power and glory of the Qing Dynasty. But it was a hollow display. Just, 3 years later in 911, the Xinhai Revolution overthrew the dynasty and established the Republic of China. Cixi's extravagant funeral had been the dynasty's last gasp. The story has a grim postscript. In 1928, a warlord named Sun Dianying, seeking to fund his army, dynamited Cixi's tomb. His soldiers looted the burial chamber, stripping it of every last treasure. They ripped the jewels from her robes and prized open her mouth to get the giant pearl. Cixi's body was reportedly thrown unceremoniously onto the floor. The tomb she had spent a fortune on to secure her eternal peace became a scene of desecration. Her carefully planned afterlife was destroyed by the greed of a new era. The paper army had been no protection at all. Number 13, could one woman's coffin bankrupt a kingdom? The funeral of Elizabeth Petrovna of Russia in 1762 was so expensive that it strained the finances of the entire empire. She had ordered over 15,000 dresses during her lifetime and never wore the same one twice. Her funeral attire was a silver dress embroidered with gold, and she was laid in a coffin made of solid silver, also trimmed with gold. The official mourning period lasted for 6 months, during which all public entertainment was banned, and the nobility was required to wear black, a huge expense for the entire court. Elizabeth Petrovna was the daughter of Peter the Great, the modernizer of Russia. She was known for her beauty, her love of parties, and her extravagant lifestyle. She came to the throne in 1741 through a palace coup, deposing the infant Emperor Ivan VI. Her reign of 20 years is often called a second golden age for the Russian aristocracy. She abolished internal customs duties, which boosted the economy, and she founded Moscow State University. She also oversaw the construction of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, a building of staggering opulence with over 1,500 rooms. Her personal spending was legendary. She was a passionate follower of fashion, particularly French fashion. Her wardrobe was immense. After her death, an inventory found over 15,000 gowns, several thousand pairs of shoes, and a seemingly endless supply of silk stockings. She had a passion for masquerade balls, where social roles were often reversed, with servants dressing as masters and men dressing as women. These parties were held frequently and were incredibly lavish. This love for opulence extended to every aspect of her life, and she planned for it to extend into her death as well. Like many monarchs, she did not want to leave her funeral to chance. She wanted her final appearance to be as grand as any of her famous balls. The preparations began long before her death. The materials for her coffin and funeral robes were sourced and stored, waiting for the inevitable day. She died in January 1762. As soon as the news broke, the empire was put into a state of prescribed mourning. The rules were strict and detailed. The court was divided into different classes of mourners, each with specific regulations for their attire. The deepest mourning was for the immediate imperial family, who wore black wool and crepe with no decorations. Other levels of the court had slightly less restrictive rules, but black was mandatory for everyone. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was an order. The cost of outfitting thousands of nobles and courtiers in new, appropriate mourning clothes was enormous. Merchants who sold fabric and dyes made a fortune. The centerpiece of the initial mourning was the lying in state. Elizabeth's body was embalmed and dressed in a magnificent silver dress, heavily embroidered with gold thread. She was placed on a grand catafalque, a raised platform in the Winter Palace. The room was draped in black velvet. Thousands of candles burned day and night. An honor guard stood vigil around the clock. For 6 weeks, the public was allowed to file past to pay their respects. This was a crucial part of the ritual, allowing the people to see their deceased ruler and acknowledge the transfer of power to her successor, her nephew, Peter III. The sheer amount of fabric used was incredible. Black cloth was ordered to cover the walls of entire halls in the palace. It was used to drape columns, mirrors, and furniture. Even the imperial carriages were covered in black. The cost of the candles alone was a significant state expense. The funeral procession itself, from the Winter Palace to the Peter and Paul Cathedral, where the Romanovs were buried, was a masterpiece of solemn pageantry. The procession was led by heralds, who proclaimed the titles of the deceased empress. They were followed by regiments of the army, their banners and drums draped in black. Our clergy from the Orthodox Church marched, swinging censers of incense. The coffin, made of silver and gold, was carried on a funeral car drawn by 8 black horses. Each horse was led by a groom, and the car was surrounded by high-ranking officials. Behind the coffin walked the new emperor, Peter III, and the imperial family. They were followed by the entire court, foreign ambassadors, and the nobility of the empire, all in their prescribed mourning clothes. The procession moved slowly through the streets of St. Petersburg. The silence of the vast crowds was broken only by the tolling of church bells, the mournful music of military bands, and the chanting of priests. The service at the cathedral was long and elaborate. The Orthodox funeral service is a powerful and complex ritual, full of prayers and hymns for the soul of the departed. The patriarch himself presided over the ceremony for the empress. After the service, the coffin was sealed and placed in the vault beneath the cathedral, alongside her father, Peter the Great. But the expense did not end there. The official mourning period continued for 6 months. All theaters, balls, and public festivities were forbidden. The court remained in black. This prolonged period of austerity was not just a sign of respect, it was a damper on the economy of the capital. Restaurants and entertainers lost business. Life was subdued and somber. Furthermore, memorial services were ordered to be held in churches throughout the empire. The government also distributed alms to the poor in the empress's name, another significant cost. Every detail was calculated to project an image of a powerful, stable, and pious empire grieving for its beloved mother. The final bill for Elizabeth's funeral was a testament to her life of excess. It placed a heavy burden on the state treasury, which was already depleted by the ongoing 7 Years' War. Her successor, Peter III, inherited a country in mourning and in debt. The extravagance of her final farewell was a perfect reflection of her reign, glorious, dazzling, and ruinously expensive. It was a spectacle that Russia could barely afford, a final grand party for the empress who loved them more than anything. Number 12. Why would a queen's funeral procession be led by an empty chair? The funeral of Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands in 1962 was held entirely in white. This was her specific request, as she saw death not as an end, but as a beginning, a birth into eternal life. The funeral carriage was white, the horses were white, and all the mourners wore white instead of the traditional black. In a striking and unusual detail, the procession was led by her empty white landau carriage, a symbol of her earthly journey coming to an end. Wilhelmina was a formidable figure who reigned over the Netherlands for 50 years, from 1890 to 1948. She became queen at the age of 10, with her mother acting as regent until she turned 18. Her long reign saw World War I, the economic crisis of the 1930s, and World War II. During the Second World War, when the Netherlands was occupied, she became a symbol of the Dutch resistance. She escaped to London and established a government in exile. Through her radio broadcasts from London, she became an inspiration to her people, a voice of hope and defiance. She was known for her strong will and her deep sense of duty. After the war, she returned to a hero's welcome. However, the strain of the war and controversies over the Dutch colonial empire took their toll. In 1948, after celebrating her Golden Jubilee, she abdicated the throne in favor of her daughter, Juliana. She retired from public life and took the title of princess. In her later years, Wilhelmina became deeply religious and interested in spirituality. Her views on death were shaped by her strong faith. She did not see it as a somber occasion for mourning, but as a joyful transition. This perspective was the driving force behind the unusual plans she made for her own funeral. She wrote down detailed instructions, wanting her final ceremony to be a reflection of her beliefs. When she died in November 1962 at the age of 82, these instructions were put into effect. The result was a funeral unlike any other royal funeral of its time. The dominant color was white. White is a color of mourning in some cultures, but in the West it is more commonly associated with joy, purity, and new beginnings, like weddings and baptisms. This was exactly the message Wilhelmina wanted to send. Her body lay in state at a chapel near her home. The coffin was simple, covered with a white pall. From there, it was taken to the town of Delft for the official funeral and burial in the new church, the traditional resting place of the Dutch royal family. The funeral procession was a stunning sight. The hearse was a historic carriage painted completely white for the occasion. It was drawn by 8 white horses adorned with white plumes. The members of the royal family, including her daughter, Queen Juliana, and her granddaughters, followed the hearse on foot. They were all dressed in white coats and hats. The military honor guards also wore their white dress uniforms. The streets were lined with thousands of citizens, and the stark contrast of the white procession against the gray winter day was powerful and memorable. One of the most poignant and symbolic elements was at the very front of the procession. Leading the way was Wilhelmina's personal horse-drawn carriage, a white landau. It was completely empty. The carriage that had carried her through so many events in her long life now represented her departure from the earthly realm. Her journey on Earth was over. The choice of white transformed the entire mood of the event. A royal funeral is typically a very somber, heavy affair dominated by black and mournful music. Wilhelmina's funeral, while still solemn and respectful, had an atmosphere of light and hope. The music chosen for the service also reflected her wishes, including pieces that were more uplifting than traditional funeral dirges. Inside the new church in Delft, the ceremony was a blend of state protocol and personal faith. The service was Protestant, reflecting the religion of the Dutch royal house. The eulogies focused not just on her role as a monarch and a wartime leader, but also on her deep personal faith and her conviction in the afterlife. The funeral was a deeply personal statement. In an era when royal funerals were largely dictated by centuries of rigid tradition, Wilhelmina used her final act to express her own unique philosophy. She rejected the idea that death must be marked by darkness and sorrow. Instead, she presented it as a moment of transition, worthy of a color that symbolizes resurrection and eternal life. The world watched this white funeral with fascination. It was broadcast on television, and the images were striking. It was a powerful reminder that even the most formal state occasions can be imbued with profound personal meaning. Wilhelmina had been a queen of immense strength and conviction in life, and her funeral showed that this conviction extended even to her understanding of death itself. It was her final message to her people: do not mourn in darkness, but look forward with hope. The empty white carriage led the way, not into an ending, but towards a new beginning. Number 11. Did a queen's ghost attend her own funeral? The funeral of Queen Elizabeth I in 1603 was one of the most spectacular events London had ever seen. A life-sized effigy of the Queen, complete with her crown, robes, and scepter, was placed on top of her coffin. This realistic figure was so lifelike that it was said many onlookers wept as it passed, feeling as if the Queen herself was there, presiding over her own final procession. The cost of the funeral was immense, over £11,000, a fortune at the time, and it was paid for by her successor, James I, who never even met her. And Elizabeth was the last monarch of the Tudor dynasty. Her 45-year reign, the Elizabethan age, was a period of great exploration, cultural achievement, and national pride. She was a charismatic and intelligent ruler who commanded immense loyalty from her people. She had survived a difficult youth, including imprisonment in the Tower of London, to become one of England's most successful monarchs. She never married, famously declaring herself married to her kingdom. She was a constant, almost eternal figure in the lives of her subjects. And her death in March 1603, at the age of 69, plunged the nation into a state of uncertainty and grief. There was no direct Tudor heir. The crown passed to her cousin James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. For the people of England, the loss was profound. They had known no other monarch. The Virgin Queen was gone. James, now the king, understood the importance of giving his predecessor a funeral worthy of her status. It was not just about honoring Elizabeth. It was about demonstrating the continuity of power and the legitimacy of his own new reign. A magnificent funeral for the old queen would help to solidify the position of the new king. He spared no expense. The planning was meticulous. The queen's body was embalmed and placed in a lead-lined wooden coffin. For several weeks, it lay in state at Whitehall Palace, watched over by her ladies-in-waiting. During this time, London was a city in mourning. The nobility ordered vast quantities of black cloth for their mourning attire. The mood was somber, a mix of genuine sadness and anxiety about the future under a new Scottish king. The most extraordinary feature of the funeral was the effigy. The practice of using a funeral effigy was not new, but the one created for Elizabeth was a work of art. It was a life-sized, articulated wooden mannequin with a wax head modeled from her death mask. It was incredibly realistic. The face was painted to look like her in life, and it was topped with one of her famous red-haired wigs. The effigy was dressed in her actual royal robes of purple velvet trimmed with ermine. It wore her crown, and in its hands were placed the orb and scepter, the symbols of her royal authority. This effigy was placed on top of her coffin. The effect was startling. As the coffin was carried through the streets, it appeared as though the queen herself, in all her royal majesty, was lying in state for all to see. And it was a powerful and theatrical way to display the royal body without exposing the actual corpse to the public gaze. It allowed people to see their queen one last time, looking as they remembered her powerful, regal, and eternal. The funeral procession took place on April 28, 1603. It was a massive public spectacle. The entire route from Whitehall Palace to Westminster Abbey was lined with thousands of Londoners. The procession itself included over 1,600 people, all dressed in black. At the head of the procession were city officials and minor gentry. They were followed by the main body of the court servants, officials, privy councillors, and nobles, all arranged in strict order of precedence. The centerpiece was the coffin, and its stunning effigy. It was carried on a chariot drawn by 4 horses draped in black velvet. A canopy of black velvet was held over the chariot by knights. The sight of the lifelike queen, her crown glinting, moved the crowd to tears. John Stowe, a chronicler of the time, wrote that there was such a general sighing, groaning, and weeping as the like hath not been seen or known in the memory of man. They were not just mourning a person. They were mourning an entire era. The chief mourner, walking behind the coffin, was the Countess of Northampton. The new king, James I, was not present. This was traditional. It was considered improper for the new monarch to attend the funeral of their predecessor, as it symbolized the continuity of the monarchy itself. The king is dead. Long live the king. His absence emphasized that the crown had already passed on. The procession ended at Westminster Abbey, the site of English coronations and royal burials for centuries. The abbey was draped in black. The funeral service was conducted by the Archbishop of Canterbury. After a long sermon praising the Queen's long and glorious reign, her coffin was lowered into the vault in the Henry VII Chapel. She was initially buried in the vault of her grandfather Henry VII. However, this was not her final resting place. A few years later, King James, I ordered a magnificent monument to be built for Elizabeth. He also had the remains of her half-sister Mary III moved from another part of the abbey. Elizabeth's coffin was placed on top of Mary's in the same tomb. The Latin inscription on the monument reads, "Partners both in throne and grave, here rest we 2 sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of one resurrection." It was a final, ironic reunion for the 2 queens whose lives and reigns had been so deeply intertwined and often in conflict. The effigy that had been the star of the funeral was placed with other royal effigies in the abbey. It was a popular attraction for visitors for many years. Although the original robes have long since disintegrated, the wooden body and a later wax head are still part of the collection at Westminster Abbey. And Elizabeth I's funeral was a masterclass in political theater. It allowed a nation to express its collective grief for a beloved monarch while simultaneously cementing the authority of the new one. The lifelike effigy provided a focal point for that grief, a substitute for the queen herself. For those who watched it pass, the ghost of their great queen was indeed attending her own funeral, a final, silent, and majestic farewell to her people. Number 10, how do you bury a queen who is already a monument? The body of Mumtaz Mahal was not buried once, but twice. Her first burial was temporary, near the site of her death. It took 22 years and the labor of 20,000 artisans to build her final resting place. Her tomb is not just a building, it is considered one of the most beautiful structures in the world. Her funeral is, in essence, a perpetual monument of love and grief, the Taj Mahal. Mumtaz Mahal was not a reigning queen. She was the beloved wife of the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan, born Arjaman Banu Begum. She was a Persian princess. She married the then Prince Khurram, who would become Shah Jahan in 1612. It was a deep and loving marriage. She was his constant companion, his trusted advisor, and the mother of his 14 children. He gave her the title Mumtaz Mahal, meaning the chosen one of the palace. Unlike many royal marriages of the time, which were often political alliances, this was a genuine love story. Shah Jahan was devoted to her. She traveled with him on his military campaigns and was his confidante in all matters of state. Her death in 1631 was a devastating blow to the emperor. She died in Burhanpur in the Deccan Plateau while giving birth to their 14th child. She had accompanied her husband on a military campaign to suppress a rebellion. The emperor was grief-stricken. According to court chroniclers, his hair turned gray almost overnight. He went into a secluded mourning for a full year. During this time, he forswore music, rich food, and fine clothing. The entire court was expected to follow his example. Mumtaz Mahal's body was initially buried in a garden in Burhanpur, in a temporary tomb, but Shah Jahan was determined to create a mausoleum for her that would be unparalleled in beauty and grandeur, a paradise on earth for his beloved wife. He wanted a monument that would be worthy of his love and her memory. He chose a site on the banks of the Yamuna River in Agra, the Mughal capital. The design was a synthesis of Persian, Indian, and Islamic architectural styles. The emperor himself was deeply involved in the planning, overseeing the designs and models. He brought in the best architects, artists, and craftsmen from across the Mughal Empire and from as far away as Central Asia and the Middle East. Construction began in 1632. The scale of the project was immense. The central tomb was the first part to be completed. It is made of brilliant white marble that seems to change color with the light of the day, from pink at sunrise to milky white in the evening and golden in the moonlight. The marble was quarried from Makrana, over 200 miles away, and was transported to Agra by a fleet of over 1,000 elephants. The decoration of the tomb is breathtaking. The white marble is inlaid with semi-precious stones like jade, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and carnelian, forming intricate floral and geometric patterns. This technique is known as Paitradura. The stones were sourced from all over Asia, the lapis from Afghanistan, the jade from China, the turquoise from Tibet, and the carnelian from Arabia. The tomb is perfectly symmetrical. It stands on a square marble platform with a minaret or tower at each corner. The main structure is topped by a large onion-shaped dome, which is surrounded by 4 smaller domes. Inside the main chamber, at the center of the building, is the cenotaph, or false tomb, of Mumtaz Mahal. It is an exquisitely carved marble monument decorated with floral inlays and inscriptions from the Quran. The actual sarcophagus containing her remains is in a quiet crypt directly below the main chamber, hidden from public view. The central tomb is only part of the complex. It is flanked by 2 identical red sandstone buildings, one a mosque and the other a guest house. The entire complex is set within a vast formal garden, a charbagh, which is divided by water channels into 4 quadrants. The garden is meant to represent the paradise promised in the Quran. The complex is entered through a massive main gateway, also made of red sandstone, which frames the first view of the tomb perfectly. The construction was a massive undertaking. Over 20,000 workers were employed, including stonecutters, masons, calligraphers, and inlay artists. The cost was enormous, estimated to be around 32 million rupees at the time, an astronomical sum. The project took 22 years to complete, with the main tomb finished around 1643 and the rest of the complex by 1653. When the mausoleum was finally ready, Mumtaz Mahal's body was exhumed from its temporary grave in Burhanpur. It was transported to Agra in a solemn procession. A second funeral ceremony was held, and her remains were interred in the crypt of the Taj Mahal, her final magnificent resting place. Shah Jahan had intended to build a matching mausoleum for himself in black marble on the opposite bank of the Yamuna River, connected to the Taj Mahal by a bridge. This would have created an even more spectacular monument. However, his plans were cut short. In his later years, he was overthrown by his son, Aurangzeb, and was imprisoned in the Agra fort. He spent the last years of his life as a prisoner, able to gaze at the Taj Mahal from his window. When Shah Jahan died in 1666, his son did not build him a separate tomb. Instead, he had his father buried in the crypt of the Taj Mahal next to his beloved wife. His cenotaph was placed next to hers in the main chamber. It is the only element that breaks the perfect symmetry of the interior design. The funeral of Mumtaz Mahal was not a single event. It was a decades-long process of construction and creation. The Taj Mahal is not just a tomb, it is the ultimate expression of one man's grief and love. It has transcended its purpose as a burial place to become a universal symbol of eternal love. Her funeral did not end with the burial of her body. It continues every day as millions of visitors come to witness the monument that her death inspired. She is not remembered for how she died, but for the breathtaking beauty that her memory created. Number 9, what if your coffin was a boat set on fire? The funeral of the Viking queen Asa is believed to be represented by the Oseberg ship burial, one of the most spectacular archaeological finds of the Viking Age. Discovered on a farm in Norway in 1904, the burial mound contained a nearly perfectly preserved Viking ship dating to 834 AD. The ship was not meant for war, but was a lavish personal vessel. It was filled with an incredible array of treasures and the remains of 2 women. It is widely believed that the elder woman was Queen Asa, a powerful figure from the Qing Dynasty. The ship itself was the coffin, a vessel to carry her and her companion to the afterlife. The Vikings had a complex and varied set of beliefs about death and the afterlife. Not everyone was buried in the same way. The most prestigious and powerful individuals, however, were often, given a ship burial. The ship was a central element of Viking life. It was a symbol of wealth, power, and mobility. It carried them on raids, on trading missions, and to explore new lands. It was only fitting that it should also carry them on their final journey to the next world. There were 2 main types of ship burials. In some cases, the deceased and their grave goods were placed in a ship, which was then set adrift and set on fire. This fiery spectacle is the image many people have of a Viking funeral. However, a more common practice for high-status individuals was to bury the entire ship on land. A large pit was dug. The ship was placed inside, and a massive burial mound, or barrow, was constructed over it. This created a permanent, highly visible monument on the landscape. The Oseberg burial is the most famous example of this type. The Oseberg ship is a masterpiece of Viking craftsmanship. It is over 70 feet long and made of oak. It is elegantly designed with a high curving prow and stern, intricately carved with animal motifs. This was not a rugged longship built for battle, but a beautiful carvey, a type of vessel used for travel in coastal waters. It was likely the personal yacht of a very wealthy and powerful person. The burial took place in 834 AD. A large pit was dug, and the ship was dragged ashore and placed inside. A burial chamber was built on the deck of the ship. Inside this chamber, the bodies of 2 women were laid out on a bed. One woman was elderly, between 60 and 70 years old. The other was younger, around 50. Analysis of their remains suggests the older woman was of very high status. She ate a rich diet, and her bones showed she did not perform hard physical labor. The younger woman's status is less clear. She may have been a high-ranking companion or a servant sacrificed to accompany her mistress into the afterlife. Many historians believe the older woman was Queen Asa, the grandmother of Harald Fairhair, the first king to unite Norway. The ship was then loaded with an astonishing collection of grave goods, everything the deceased would need for a comfortable and prestigious existence in the next world. The items found in the Oseberg burial provide an unparalleled glimpse into the luxurious lifestyle of the Viking elite. There were beds, chests, and chairs, all intricately carved. There was a richly decorated wooden cart or wagon, and several ornate sledges. There were kitchen utensils, including pots, pans, and knives. There were looms and other textile tools, indicating the importance of weaving. Remnants of fine fabrics, including silk, were found. The burial also included the remains of 15 horses, 4 dogs, and 2 oxen. These animals were sacrificed to serve their mistress in the afterlife. The scale of the offering was immense. Every item was of the highest quality and craftsmanship. The detailed animal head carvings on the posts in the burial chamber and on the sledges are some of the finest examples of Viking art ever found. Once the ship was filled, it was covered with a massive mound of earth, turf, and stones, creating a prominent landmark. This barrow served not only as a tomb, but also as a powerful statement. It declared the wealth, status, and importance of the person buried within to all who saw it. It was a claim on the land and a monument to the power of a dynasty. Unfortunately, the mound did not remain undisturbed. It was broken into by tomb robbers in the Middle Ages. The robbers cut a tunnel into the burial chamber, likely searching for precious metals and weapons, which were conspicuously absent when the tomb was excavated. They disturbed the skeletons and damaged some of the artifacts, but they left the vast majority of the wooden and textile treasures behind, as these were of no value to them. The Oseberg Mound was excavated in 1904. The discovery was sensational. The clay soil and the airtight conditions of the barrow had preserved the wood to a remarkable degree. The ship and its contents were carefully removed, piece by piece. The process of conserving and reconstructing the ship and its artifacts took over 20 years. Today, the Oseberg ship and its treasures are the main attraction at the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo. The Oseberg burial reveals the Viking attitude towards death for their elite. It was not a simple disposal of a body, but a grand, resource-intensive public ceremony. The funeral was a piece of theater, a demonstration of power that reinforced the social order. The enormous wealth and labor invested in the burial, building the ship, carving the goods, sacrificing the animals, and constructing the mound was a testament to the status of the deceased. It was a way for the community to honor their leader and for her successors to legitimize their own power. Queen Asa's final journey was not in a simple coffin, but in a magnificent work of art, a floating palace intended to carry her in style to the halls of the gods. Number 8. Why was a queen buried with her husband's heart? Queen Anne of Bohemia died in 1394, and her husband, King Richard II of England, was so overcome with grief that he ordered the royal manor at Qing, where she died, to be completely demolished. He had been married to her for 12 years, and their marriage was a famously happy one. For her funeral, he commissioned a joint tomb for them, both in Westminster Abbey, even though he was still alive. The tomb effigy depicts them holding hands, and it was specified that Richard would be buried with Anne, holding her hand for eternity. He also had her father's heart, which had been in his possession, buried with her. Anne of Bohemia was the daughter of Charles IV, the Holy Roman Emperor. Her marriage to the young King Richard II of England in 1382 was a diplomatic one, meant to forge an alliance against France. She was only 15 at the time. Initially, the English public was not impressed with the marriage, as she brought no dowry. But Anne quickly won over the people and, more importantly, her husband. Their marriage was a genuine partnership and a loving relationship, a rarity in a time of arranged royal matches. Anne had a gentle and kind nature, and she was known for her efforts to mediate in political disputes. She often interceded on behalf of people who had angered the king, earning her the nickname Good Queen Anne. Richard, who had a tempestuous and often insecure personality, was devoted to her. Her presence seemed to have a calming and steadying influence on him. Tragedy struck in June 1394. While the court was residing at Sheen Palace in Richmond, the plague swept through. Anne, just 28 years old, fell ill and died. Richard was utterly devastated. His grief was profound and dramatic. In a fit of sorrow and rage, he commanded that the magnificent Sheen Palace, a place he had loved, be torn down to its foundations. He could not bear to be in the place where his wife had died. It was an extreme and costly reaction that demonstrated the depth of his loss. Richard immediately began planning a funeral of unprecedented splendor. He was determined that Anne's final ceremony would be a testament to his love for her. He sent orders throughout the kingdom for the nobility to attend the funeral in London. He also ordered vast quantities of wax from Flanders to make thousands of candles and torches for the procession and the service. The expense was enormous. The funeral took place in August, 2 months after her death, allowing time for all the preparations and for nobles from around the country to travel to London. The procession from Sheen to Westminster Abbey was a grand and solemn affair. The coffin was carried on an open bier, allowing the public to see it. Richard himself walked as the chief mourner. The procession was illuminated by a forest of torches. The sheer amount of wax imported for the occasion was a major topic of conversation and complaint, as it drove up the price of candles for everyone. But Richard spared no expense. He wanted Anne's path to her grave to be lit like a celestial highway. During the service at Westminster Abbey, there was a moment of high drama that revealed Richard's fragile emotional state. The Earl of Arundel, one of Richard's political opponents, arrived late and then asked for permission to leave early. Richard, seeing this as a sign of disrespect to Anne's memory, flew into a rage. He physically attacked the Earl, striking him in the face. The service had to be paused while the commotion was sorted out. It was a shocking breach of decorum that showed how raw Richard's grief was. Perhaps the most touching and lasting part of Richard's tribute to Anne was the tomb he commissioned. Even though he was a healthy young man of 27, he ordered a magnificent double tomb for them in the abbey. This was highly unusual. The tomb was made of Purbeck marble, and on top it featured gilded bronze effigies of himself and Anne, lying side by side. He specified that they should be depicted holding hands. Their right hands are clasped together, a symbol of their marital union and enduring love. The tomb was created by the best craftsmen of the day and was incredibly expensive. The inscriptions praise Anne's beauty, piety, and kindness. By building this joint tomb, Richard was making a powerful statement. He was tying his own legacy and his eternal rest directly to his wife. He wanted the world to know that they were inseparable, even in death. In a strange and poignant detail, Richard also had a special relic buried with Anne, the heart of her father, Emperor Charles IV. It is not entirely clear how the heart came to be in England, but it was a precious item, and by burying it with her, Richard was uniting her in death with her imperial lineage. Richard II reigned for another 5 years after Anne's death. Without her moderating influence, he became more tyrannical and erratic. He was eventually overthrown by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV in 1399 and died in captivity the following year, likely murdered. Despite the violent end to his reign, his wishes for his burial were eventually honored. After being buried temporarily elsewhere, his body was moved to Westminster Abbey in 1413 by King Henry V. He was laid to rest in the magnificent tomb he had built next to his beloved Anne. Their gilded effigies, hands clasped, remain one of the most moving royal monuments in the abbey, a testament to a royal marriage that was, against all odds, a true love story. His grief was so great that he built a home for their shared death while he was still living. Number 7. Could a queen's funeral start a civil war? The funeral of Queen Mercedes of Spain in 1878 was a national tragedy that captured the heart of the country. She was a young, beautiful queen who had married for love, and she died of typhoid fever just 5 months after her wedding. Her husband, King Alfonso XII, was inconsolable. The funeral was an outpouring of public grief, and the story of the tragic queen became the subject of poems, songs, and plays. The political stability she represented was so fragile that her death created a real fear that the country could slide back into the Civil War and chaos from which it had just emerged. Maria de las Mercedes of Orleans was a Spanish princess. She was the cousin of King Alfonso XX. They had grown up together and had fallen deeply in love as teenagers. However, their marriage was not a simple affair. Spain in the 19th century was a deeply divided and politically unstable country. Alfonso's mother, Queen Isabella II, had been overthrown, leading to a period of republicanism and then the Carlist Wars, a series of civil wars over the succession to the throne. Alfonso was restored to the throne in 1874, ending the First Spanish Republic. His position was still precarious. He needed to unite the country and bring stability. A key part of his strategy was his marriage. The government wanted him to marry a European princess to secure a foreign alliance. But Alfonso was adamant. He would marry only one person, his cousin Mercedes. Despite political opposition, the king's will prevailed. They were married in a lavish ceremony in Madrid in January 1878. The public was enchanted by the royal love story. Mercedes was just 17, beautiful and charismatic. Alfonso was 20. They were a fairy tale couple, a symbol of hope, and a new, more peaceful era for Spain. The wedding was a moment of national celebration, but the fairy tale was short-lived. Just a few months into the marriage, in the early summer of 1878, Queen Mercedes fell gravely ill. The diagnosis was typhoid fever, a deadly disease in the 19th century. The king stayed by her bedside, rarely leaving her. The public anxiously followed the news of her health. Despite the best efforts of her doctors, her condition worsened. She died on June 26, 1878, 2 days after her 18th birthday. She had been queen for only 154 days. The nation was plunged into mourning. The king was completely shattered by her death. His grief was public and palpable. He had lost not only his queen, but the love of his life. The sense of national tragedy was immense. The hopeful new era that the royal couple had seemed to promise was now shrouded in sorrow. The funeral was a massive event reflecting the depth of the nation's grief. Her body lay in state at the royal palace in Madrid. The room was draped in black, and the young queen's body was surrounded by a sea of candles. Thousands of people, from nobles to ordinary citizens, filed past her coffin to pay their last respects. The sight of the grieving king, standing vigil over his dead wife, moved the entire country. The funeral procession to the royal burial site at El Escorial was one of the largest Madrid had ever witnessed. The streets were packed with silent, grieving crowds. The coffin was carried on a magnificent hearse, and the procession included all the great institutions of the state, the government, the army, the nobility, and the church. The scale of the funeral was a reflection of her position, but the emotional intensity was a reflection of the public's genuine affection for her. Her death was more than a personal tragedy for the king. It was a political crisis. Alfonso's reign was still new and not entirely secure. The stability of the restored monarchy depended on him producing an heir. Mercedes' death meant the succession was once again uncertain. The Carlists, who had been defeated but not eliminated, could see this as an opportunity to renew their claim to the throne. The fear that her death could trigger another round of political instability and even a return to civil war was very real. The government immediately began to pressure the king to remarry. Alfonso was still deep in mourning and resisted the idea. But duty prevailed. He knew he had to secure the future of the monarchy. A year and a half later, he married Archduchess Maria Christina of Austria. While this marriage was a successful political match and produced the necessary heir, it was clear that his heart still belonged to Mercedes. Mercedes could not be buried in the main royal pantheon at El Escorial, as the rules stated that only queens who had been mothers of kings could be interred there. She was instead buried in a nearby chapel. This was a source of great sadness for Alfonso. Years later, construction began on a new cathedral in Madrid, the Almudena Cathedral. Alfonso XII supported the project with the intention that it would one day be his wife's final resting place. His wish was finally fulfilled over a century later. In 2000, the remains of Queen Mercedes were moved from El Escorial and reinterred in a special chapel in the Almudena Cathedral, opposite the royal palace where she had lived her brief life as queen. The story of the tragic young queen has endured in Spanish culture. Her short, romantic, and sad life became the stuff of legend. A popular Spanish song, or copla, tells the story of her romance and early death. Her funeral was the dramatic climax of a story that the entire nation felt they were a part of. It was an event where the personal grief of a king and the political anxieties of a nation merged into one great spectacle of mourning. Number 6. Who wore the crown at a queen's funeral? When Mary, Queen of Scots, was finally given a royal funeral in 1612, it was 25 years after her execution. The ceremony was ordered by her son James I of England, who had been King of Scotland when she was executed but had done little to save her. The funeral was a grand affair, and at the head of the procession a crown was carried on a velvet cushion representing the royalty she had been denied at her death. Her body was exhumed from its simple grave and reburied in a magnificent tomb in Westminster Abbey, directly opposite the tomb of her cousin and rival, Queen Elizabeth I. The life of Mary, Queen of Scots, was one of constant drama, romance, and tragedy. She became Queen of Scotland when she was just 6 days old. She was sent to France as a child and married the French heir, briefly becoming Queen of France as well. After her husband's death, she returned to Scotland to rule a country that was in the midst of the turbulent Protestant Reformation. As a Catholic queen in a newly Protestant nation, her position was difficult from the start. Her reign in Scotland was marred by scandal, political intrigue, and a series of disastrous marriages. She was eventually forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James. She fled to England, seeking the protection of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth 1000, but instead of protection, Mary found imprisonment. Elizabeth saw the Catholic Mary, who had a strong claim to the English throne, as a major threat. Mary was held in captivity in various English castles for 19 years. She became the focal point for numerous Catholic plots to overthrow Elizabeth. In 1586, she was implicated in the Babington plot. She was tried for treason, found guilty, and sentenced to death. Queen Elizabeth I was hesitant to sign the death warrant for a fellow anointed queen, but she was eventually persuaded by her counselors. Mary was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle in February 1587. Her execution was a grim affair. She was denied the rights of a Catholic priest. She was buried in a simple lead coffin with little ceremony in Peterborough Cathedral. It was an ignominious end for a woman who had been queen of two countries. Her son, James VI of Scotland, protested the execution of his mother, but took no real action. His eye was on the bigger prize, the English throne. He knew that if he reacted too strongly, he could jeopardize his chances of succeeding the childless Elizabeth. And succeed. Her he did. When Elizabeth I died in 1603, James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting the crowns of the two kingdoms. For the first few years of his reign in England, he did nothing about his mother's burial, but as he consolidated his power, he turned his attention to restoring her honor and memory. It was a way of smoothing over his own inaction at the time of her death and reinforcing the divine right and sanctity of monarchs. In 1612, James ordered that his mother's body be exhumed from Peterborough Cathedral. He commissioned a magnificent white marble tomb for her in the Henry VII Chapel in Westminster Abbey, the most prestigious burial place in the kingdom. The tomb was designed by the same sculptor who had created Elizabeth I's tomb a few years earlier. The reburial of Mary was staged as a grand royal funeral, the kind she had been denied a quarter of a century earlier. Her coffin was transported from Peterborough to London in a solemn procession. The ceremony at Westminster Abbey was one of great pomp and circumstance. It was attended by the highest nobles of the land. A key symbolic element of the procession was the carrying of a crown on a cushion. This was to make it clear that this was the funeral of a legitimate queen. It was a public declaration of the royal status that her enemies had tried to strip from her. An effigy of Mary, similar to the one used for Elizabeth's funeral, may also have been used, though accounts are less clear on this point. The location James chose for her tomb was highly significant. It is in the south aisle of the Henry VII Chapel. Directly across the central aisle, in the north aisle, is the tomb of Queen Elizabeth I. By placing his mother's tomb in a position of equal prominence to that of her great rival, James was making a powerful political and personal statement. He was restoring his mother's dignity and putting her on an equal footing with the queen who had ordered her death. The two queens who had been rivals in life were now united as equals in death, perpetual neighbors in the royal necropolis. Mary's tomb is actually larger and more ornate than Elizabeth's, perhaps a final, subtle act of filial devotion from her son. The white marble effigy on top depicts Mary in a regal pose, a testament to the royalty her son wanted to commemorate. The inscription in Latin describes her as a Queen of Scotland by right, Queen of France by marriage, and a claimant to the throne of England. The funeral of Mary, Queen of Scots, was a unique event. It was a posthumous restoration of honor. It was an act of political stagecraft by a son seeking to legitimize his own dynasty and smooth over an uncomfortable chapter of his own past. It was a funeral that took place 25 years too late, but it finally gave the tragic queen the royal farewell she had always been due. The crown carried in her procession was a symbol of a victory won long after the battle was over. Number 5. Did a queen's funeral last for 40 days? When the Byzantine Empress Theodora died in 548 AD, her husband, the Emperor Justinian, was consumed by a grief that shaped the rest of his reign. The mourning period for the Empress was elaborate and extended. Her funeral procession from the palace to the Church of the Holy Apostles was a massive display of imperial and religious ceremony. The traditions of the Byzantine court dictated a long and complex series of rituals, and the mourning for an empress as powerful and influential as Theodora would have been observed with the utmost solemnity for a period of 40 days, culminating in a final memorial service. Theodora was one of the most remarkable women of the late Roman or Byzantine world. She did not come from a noble background. Her father was a bearkeeper for the Hippodrome in Constantinople, the city's great chariot racing stadium. In her youth, she was an actress and entertainer, a profession that was considered scandalous and of low social standing at the time. She met Justinian, the heir to the imperial throne, and he was captivated by her beauty, intelligence, and wit. He fell deeply in love with her. In order to marry her, he had to persuade his uncle, the Emperor Justin, to change the law that forbade senators from marrying actresses. They were married, and when Justinian became emperor in 527 AD, Theodora was crowned empress, his co-ruler. She was not a passive empress. She was Justinian's most trusted advisor and a major political force in her own right. She was intelligent, courageous, and ruthless. The most famous example of her influence came during the Nika riots of 532 AD. A massive rebellion broke out in Constantinople, and the city was in flames. Justinian's advisors urged him to flee. It was Theodora who refused to go. In a famous speech, she declared that she would rather die an empress than live as an exile, and that the royal purple is the noblest shroud. Her courage rallied Justinian and his generals, who then crushed the rebellion. She saved her husband's throne. She took a keen interest in social justice, particularly in laws protecting women. She established homes for former prostitutes, passed laws giving women more rights in divorce, and enacted a law making the rape of a woman a capital offense. She was also a savvy political operator with her own network of spies and allies. She and Justinian were a true power couple, ruling the empire together. Her death from cancer in 548 AD was a devastating blow to Justinian. He had lost not only his wife, but his partner in power. He never remarried. For the remaining 17 years of his reign, he often passed laws in her memory and seemed to be guided by what he believed her wishes would have been. The funeral of a Byzantine emperor or empress was a highly ritualized and solemn event, blending Roman imperial traditions with Christian religious ceremony. When Theodora died, her body would have been washed, anointed, and dressed in the magnificent imperial robes. She would have been laid out on a golden bier in the main hall of the Great Palace of Constantinople. The court would have filed past to pay their respects, a formal and silent ritual. The funeral procession to the Church of the Holy Apostles, the burial place of Byzantine emperors, was the main public event. The procession was a display of the power and hierarchy of the Byzantine state. It was led by candlebearers and clergy, chanting psalms and hymns. The bier carrying the empress's body was the centerpiece, surrounded by the highest-ranking officials of the court and the army. The emperor himself, Justinian, would have walked as the chief mourner, his face a mask of public grief. The procession moved slowly through the main streets of the capital, which were lined with silent crowds. The Church of the Holy Apostles was one of the most important churches in Constantinople, second only to the Hagia Sophia. It was a mausoleum for the emperors, founded by Constantine the Great. Inside, a solemn funeral liturgy was celebrated by the Patriarch of Constantinople. After the service, Theodora's body was placed in a sarcophagus made of porphyry, a hard purple stone reserved for imperial use. Her sarcophagus was placed next to the one Justinian had prepared for himself. The mourning, however, did not end with the burial. In Orthodox Christian tradition, memorial services are held at specific intervals after a death, most importantly on the 3rd day, the 9th day, and the 40th day. The 40-day period is particularly significant as it is believed to be the time it takes for the soul to complete its journey after leaving the body. For an empress, this period of mourning would have been observed by the entire court and capital. Public life would have been subdued. Justinian himself would have remained in deep mourning, setting the tone for the empire. On the 40th day after Theodora's death, a final grand memorial service, or panihida, would have been held at the Church of the Holy Apostles. This service would have marked the end of the official mourning period and would have been another major state ceremony attended by all the important figures of the empire. Justinian's devotion to Theodora's memory was unwavering. He had her image included in the famous mosaics in the Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna, Italy. The mosaics, which are still visible today, depict Justinian and his court on one side and Theodora and her retinue on the other. Even though she never visited Ravenna, he ensured she was immortalized there as his equal. Her death left a void in his life and in the governance of the empire that was never truly filled. Her 40-day funeral was the beginning of his own 17-year-long period of mourning. Number 4. How can a country mourn a queen? They never knew. The funeral of Queen Astrid of the Belgians in 1935 was an event of immense international grief. She was a Swedish princess who had become a beloved queen in her adopted country. She was killed in a car accident in Switzerland at the age of 29. Her death was a sudden and shocking tragedy. The funeral procession in Brussels was watched by an estimated 2 million mourners, many of whom had never seen her in person, but felt a deep personal connection to the young, beautiful, and charitable queen. Astrid of Sweden was born into the Swedish royal family. She was known for her natural beauty, her gentle and unassuming manner, and her genuine kindness. In 1926, she married Prince Leopold of Belgium, the heir to the Belgian throne. The match was a true love story, not an arranged political marriage. The Belgian people were immediately charmed by their new princess. She learned French and Dutch, the languages of her new country, and embraced her role with grace. When King Albert I died in a mountaineering accident in 1934, Leopold became King Leopold III, and Astrid became Queen of the Belgians. She was queen for only a year and a half, but in that short time she made a profound impact. She was known as the Snow Queen because of her Scandinavian origins and her fair beauty, but she had a warm heart. She was deeply involved in charitable work, particularly concerning women and children. During an economic crisis in 1935, she organized a collection of clothing and food for the poor, which became known as the Queen's Appeal. She was a very modern and accessible royal, often seen walking in the park with her 3 young children. The public adored her. In August 1935, the royal couple was on a private holiday in Switzerland. They had sent the children home and were enjoying some time alone. On the morning of August 29th, they went for a drive along the shore of Lake Lucerne. King Leopold was driving the car, and Queen Astrid was in the passenger seat looking at a map. For a moment, the king was distracted. The car went off the road, down a steep bank, and crashed into a tree. The queen was thrown from the vehicle and was killed instantly. The king was only slightly injured. The news of her death was a profound shock to Belgium and to the world. A young, vibrant queen, the mother of 3 small children, was gone in an instant. The tragedy was made even more poignant by the fact that her husband was at the wheel. And King Leopold's grief was immense, compounded by the circumstances of the accident. Her body was brought back to Brussels by train. At every station the train passed through, day and night. People gathered to pay their respects in silent tribute. When the train arrived in Brussels, a vast silent crowd was waiting. The streets were lined with mourners as the coffin was taken to the royal palace. The funeral was held a few days later. It was one of the largest public gatherings in Belgium's history. The procession route from the palace to the Cathedral of St. Michael and St. Gudula was several miles long. An estimated 2 million people lined the streets. This was a significant portion of the entire population of Belgium at the time. The funeral was a state, military, and religious ceremony all in one. The coffin was placed on a gun carriage covered with the Belgian flag. Walking behind the coffin was the devastated King Leopold III, his head bowed in grief. He was followed by foreign royalty and dignitaries from around the world, including the future King George VI of the United Kingdom and the Crown Prince of Sweden, Astrid's brother. The procession included delegations from the Belgian Army, Navy, and Air Force, as well as civic and charitable organizations. The grief of the crowd was overwhelming. People openly wept in the streets. They had lost not just a monarch, but a figure they had come to see as a symbol of kindness and motherhood. She had been queen for such a short time, and most of them had never met her or even seen her. But they felt they knew her. Through newspaper articles, photographs, and newsreels, she had become a familiar and beloved presence in their lives. Her charitable work had touched many directly. The funeral service in the cathedral was broadcast on the radio, allowing the entire nation to participate in the mourning. After the service, her body was taken to the royal crypt at the Church of Our Lady of Laeken, the burial place of the Belgian royals. The death of Queen Astrid left a lasting scar on the Belgian monarchy and on the nation. King Leopold was a changed man, and his subsequent actions during World War II would become highly controversial. Many believed he never fully recovered from the trauma of her death. The mourning for Queen Astrid was a powerful example of how a royal figure can capture the public imagination. She represented an ideal of royalty, beautiful, compassionate, dedicated to her family and her people. Her sudden, tragic death elevated her to an almost mythical status. The funeral was the moment when the people of Belgium, and indeed the world, came together to mourn the loss of a queen they felt was their own. It was a mass grieving for a person most had never met, but whose loss felt deeply personal. Number 3, why did a king ban mirrors to mourn his queen? When Queen Isabella I of Castile died in 1504, her husband, King Ferdinand of Aragon, was so distraught that he reportedly could not bear to see his own aged and grief-stricken face. According to some accounts, he ordered all the mirrors in the palace to be covered. Her funeral procession was an arduous 25-day journey of over 300 miles in the middle of winter, from the place of her death to her chosen burial site in Granada. The terrible weather that plagued the journey was seen by many as the heavens themselves weeping for the great queen. Isabella I of Castile was one of the most significant and powerful ruling queens in history. Along with her husband, Ferdinand of Aragon, she unified Spain, completed the Reconquista by conquering the final Muslim kingdom of Granada, and sponsored Christopher Columbus's voyage that led to the European discovery of the Americas. She was a devout Catholic, a shrewd political operator, and a formidable ruler. Her marriage to Ferdinand was a political partnership that created the foundation of modern Spain. While they ruled their respective kingdoms jointly, Isabella always retained primary authority in Castile. They were known as the Catholic monarchs. Her reign was one of immense change and consequence, both for Spain and for the world. Isabella had a very clear vision for her legacy and her final resting place. She had chosen Granada as her burial site. The conquest of Granada in 1492 was the crowning achievement of her reign, the culmination of centuries of effort to bring the Iberian Peninsula under Christian rule. By choosing to be buried there in the royal chapel of the cathedral she ordered to be built, she was making a powerful statement. She was cementing the Christian conquest and claiming the city for her dynasty forever. She died in November 1504 in the town of Medina del Campo after a long illness. Her death was a moment of great political uncertainty, but for her husband Ferdinand, it was also a deep personal loss. They had been married for 35 years and had ruled together through immense challenges. His grief was said to be profound. Isabella had left detailed instructions in her will regarding her funeral. She asked for a relatively simple ceremony, requesting that her body be dressed in the humble habit of a Franciscan nun. She wanted alms to be distributed to the poor rather than excessive amounts of money being spent on candles and elaborate mourning draperies. However, the journey of her body to Granada was anything but simple. It was a massive undertaking. The funeral procession set out in the harsh conditions of a Spanish winter. The journey was over 300 miles and took 25 days. The procession was led by her loyal friend, Peter Martir de Anguera, who chronicled the difficult journey. The coffin was carried on a bier, escorted by a large retinue of nobles, guards, and clergy. They traveled through rain, mud, and flooded rivers. The weather was so relentlessly awful that it seemed to be a reflection of the nation's sorrow. Peter Martyr wrote that the heavens wept for the queen. The procession had to stop frequently, and the journey was slow and miserable. It was an epic and grueling final journey, a testament to the determination to honor her final wish to be buried in Granada. When the procession finally reached Granada, the city she had conquered, her body was temporarily interred while the royal chapel was still under construction. The simple Franciscan habit she was buried in was a stark contrast to the immense power she had wielded in life. Ferdinand, despite his immense grief and the dramatic gesture of banning mirrors, was also a pragmatist. He continued to rule, now as regent of Castile, for their mentally unstable daughter Joanna. When Ferdinand died in 1516, his body was also brought to Granada to be buried next to Isabella, as he had wished. Their grandson, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, later completed the royal chapel. He commissioned a magnificent double tomb for his grandparents. The monument, carved from marble, features lifelike effigies of Isabella and Ferdinand lying side by side. It is a grand and imposing monument, far more elaborate than the simple burial Isabella had requested. Charles V wanted to create a monument that reflected the immense importance of their reign. The funeral of Isabella was a study in contrast. It combined her personal request for pious humility with the state's need for a grand spectacle. The arduous journey through the winter storms became a legendary part of her story, a final pilgrimage for the queen who had reshaped Spain. And Ferdinand's reported banning of mirrors, whether historically accurate or a later embellishment, captures the profound personal desolation that accompanied the death of one of history's most powerful women. Her funeral wasn't just an end, it was the final difficult chapter in the story of the making of Spain. Number 2, why did a queen's funeral bring an empire to a standstill? The funeral of Queen Victoria in 1901 was a spectacle on a global scale. She had reigned for 63 years, longer than any British monarch before her. She specifically requested a military funeral, as she was the daughter of a soldier and the head of the army. She also forbade the use of black, insisting on white and purple for her funeral pall. In a famous incident during the procession in London, the artillery horses meant to pull her gun carriage panicked, and a contingent of Royal Navy sailors had to step in and pull the coffin by hand, a tradition that has been repeated at British state funerals ever since. Queen Victoria ascended to the throne as a young woman of 18 and presided over the vast expansion of the British Empire. The Victorian era was a time of industrial revolution, scientific progress, and immense social change. By the end of her reign, a quarter of the world's population was her subject. She was the grandmother of Europe, with her children and grandchildren on the thrones of Germany, Russia, Greece, and other nations. She was more than a monarch. She was an institution. Her death in January 1901, at the age of 81, was a moment that people had long dreaded. For most of the population, she was the only ruler they had ever known. Her death truly marked the end of an era. Victoria, ever meticulous, had left detailed, multi-page instructions for her own funeral. She had been planning it for decades. Her instructions went against many established traditions. The most striking was her command that there be no black. Victorian funerals were famously somber, draped in black crepe. But the Queen wanted something different. She specified a white pall for her coffin. The streets were still lined with people in black, but the focus of the procession itself was to be white and purple, colors of royalty. She also insisted on a military funeral, not a state funeral. This was a reflection of her personal pride in the armed forces. It meant the ceremony would be organized by the Earl Marshal, but the procession and rituals would be military in nature. After her death at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, her body was placed in a coffin that she had also prepared for. Her son, the new King Edward VII, and her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, helped to lift her into it. She was buried with a number of highly personal and sentimental items. In her left hand, she had a photograph of her favorite servant, John Brown, along with a lock of his hair. On her right hand, she wore the wedding ring of Brown's mother. Her body was also covered with a plaster cast of the hand of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, who had died 40 years earlier. One of his dressing gowns was also placed in the coffin with her. The first stage of the funeral was a naval procession. Her coffin was carried aboard the royal yacht, HMY Alberta, to cross the Solent from the Isle of Wight to the mainland. The small yacht was escorted by a massive flotilla of warships, forming two lines that stretched for miles. Battleships from the Royal Navy and from the navies of other nations, including Germany, France, and Japan, were present. As the Alberta passed, each warship fired a salute of minute guns. It was a stunning display of global naval power, an empire paying tribute to its Empress. Once ashore, the coffin was taken by train to London. In London, the procession through the city was the main event for the public. Millions of people lined the streets, standing in silence in the cold February air. The coffin was placed on a gun carriage to be drawn by a team of white horses from the Royal Horse Artillery. This is where the famous incident occurred. The weather was very cold, and the horses, not used to the long wait, became restless and difficult to control. When the order was given to move, they panicked. There was a real fear that the coffin, containing the body of the Queen, could be toppled from the gun carriage. It was a moment of crisis in the middle of one of the most precisely planned events in history. A quick-thinking Royal Navy officer, Captain Prince Louis of Battenberg, suggested that the sailors of the Naval Honor Guard should take over. The horses were unhitched, and improvised ropes were attached to the gun carriage. A team of over 100 sailors then pulled the gun carriage for the rest of the route to Paddington Station. This impromptu action was seen as a powerful symbol of the Navy's devotion to the Queen. It was so successful that it became an official tradition for all subsequent state funerals. From London, a train took the Queen's coffin to Windsor. Another procession took place there, this time to St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle for the funeral service. The service was attended by royalty from across Europe. After the service, her coffin was taken to the Frogmore Mausoleum in Windsor Home Park. This was the magnificent mausoleum she had built for her husband, Prince Albert. She was laid to rest beside him, finally reunited with the man whose death had plunged her into decades of mourning. The funeral of Queen Victoria was the end of an age. It was a perfectly orchestrated piece of imperial theater, designed to project an image of stability and continuity at a moment of profound change. The sheer scale of it, from the Naval Review to the millions on the streets, was a testament to the power of the British Empire at its absolute zenith. It was a final grand farewell for the Queen who had defined an entire century. Number 1. Did a queen's death lead to the fall of a god? The funeral of Empress Koken of Japan in 770 AD was the last of its kind. She was a devout Buddhist, and her funeral was a lavish Buddhist ceremony involving thousands of monks and the construction of elaborate funerary structures. She was also the last woman to reign as an empress in her own right in Japan for nearly 1,000 years. Her death and the political turmoil surrounding her reign, particularly her controversial relationship with a Buddhist monk, led to a backlash against female rulers and the powerful Buddhist clergy, fundamentally changing the course of Japanese history. Her funeral was not just the end of a life, but the end of an era for both women in power and for Buddhism at the court. Empress Koken reigned twice. She was the daughter of Emperor Shomu and Empress Komyo, who were both devout Buddhists. Buddhism was still a relatively new and powerful force in Japan at the time, and the imperial court was its greatest patron. Koken first ascended the throne in 749 AD. During her first reign, she continued her father's policy of promoting Buddhism. The most famous project of this era was the completion of the great Buddha statue, the Daibutsu, at the Todaiji Temple in Nara, the capital. This colossal bronze statue was one of the largest construction projects in Japanese history, and a huge drain on the national treasury. Its dedication ceremony was a massive national event, presided over by the Empress. In 758 AD, she abdicated in favor of her chosen heir, but she did not retire. She remained a powerful figure at court. It was during this period that she became close to a Buddhist monk named Dokyo. He had supposedly healed her from an illness, and he quickly gained immense influence over her. In 764 AD, she reascended the throne, taking the new name of Empress Shotoku. Her second reign was dominated by the figure of Dokyo. She promoted him to the highest positions in the land, giving him titles like Master of the State and eventually King of the Law. His power was unprecedented for someone outside the imperial family. He lived in the palace, and rumors swirled about the nature of his relationship with the Empress. This situation caused immense anxiety among the powerful aristocratic clans, particularly the Fujiwara clan, who had traditionally held the most influence at court. They saw Dokyo as a threat to their power and to the established social order. The tension came to a head when an oracle was reported from a shrine declaring that if Dokyo were made emperor, the country would be at peace. This was a direct challenge to the imperial dynasty, which was said to be descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu. The court was thrown into crisis. The Empress sent a trusted courtier to the shrine to confirm the oracle. He returned with a new message: only a person of imperial blood could ever ascend the throne. This thwarted Dokyo's ambitions. Soon after, in 770 AD, the Empress died. With his patron and protector gone, Dokyo's fall from power was swift. He was stripped of all his titles and sent into exile. His downfall marked a major turning point. The aristocracy led by the Fujiwara reasserted their control. They selected a new emperor from a distant branch of the imperial family. The Empress's funeral would have been a grand Buddhist affair, as was the custom for the Nara period emperors. After her death, her body would have lain in state while elaborate preparations were made. This involved the construction of a temporary funeral palace, or Mogari no Miya. Her coffin would have been placed here, and for several weeks or even months, rituals, music, and eulogies would have been performed. The final funeral ceremony would have involved a large procession to her burial mound, or Misasagi. Thousands of monks from the great temples of Nara would have participated chanting sutras. The cost would have been enormous, with vast donations made to temples in her name to ensure her peaceful transition into the next life. She was cremated, a practice that had become common among the Buddhist elite, and her ashes were interred in her tomb. But the real significance of her death and funeral was in what came after. Okay? The aristocratic elite, having been so threatened by the power of a female ruler and her favorite monk, took steps to ensure such a situation could never happen again. After Empress Koken Shotoku, women were systematically excluded from the line of succession. No woman would reign as empress in her own right again until the 17th century. The idea of a female ruler became associated with the chaos and impropriety of Dokyo's rise to power. There was also a backlash against the political power of the Buddhist clergy. The court decided that the great temples of Nara had become too wealthy and influential in political affairs. A few years after the Empress's funeral, her successor, Emperor Kanmu, made a momentous decision. He decided to move the capital away from Nara, partly to escape the influence of the powerful Buddhist monasteries. This led to the founding of a new capital, Heian-kyo, which is modern-day Kyoto. This move began the Heian period, a new and distinct era of Japanese history. The funeral of Empress Koken was, therefore, far more than the end of one person's life. It was a pivot point in Japanese history. It marked the end of the era of powerful female emperors and the end of the Nara period. The political earthquake caused by her reign and her relationship with Dokyo led to a fundamental restructuring of power at the court, the exclusion of women from the throne for centuries, and the physical relocation of the center of Japanese government. Her lavish Buddhist funeral was the last rites for a whole system of power.